in particular, there's a kind of principle which says, it's sometimes called Euclid's maxim. It's just basically that like the whole of something is always greater than the proper part of it, right? So there has to be more guests in. If you think about all of the rooms in the hotel, there's more guests in the totality of rooms than if you just consider how many guests there are in all of the even numbered rooms, right? And that principle is true for any finite hotel, any finite thing, really. This Euclid's maxim applies. But it just fails when you come to thinking about infinite, say.
You don't work in academia anymore, is that correct? But you
That's
used
true.
to work, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
a long time ago, like 10 years ago, I did.
Yeah.
So I did my PhD, and then I worked for a year after that in the same place where I got it. And then I got a job working in a different institution, like a temporary cover thing, which is pretty standard early researcher, early career kind of phase thing to do. And yeah, I just wasn't really feeling it at the time so much. I think it's challenging when you pick your PhD subject and then you zoom right in on a tiny little nuanced area, and
Yeah.
then I think I just kind of got to the end of like I was still interested in it, but I wasn't interested enough in it anymore. And there were just like it was so formal and technical, and there were just a lot of people. There's not many people in that area, but there were people who were just naturally better logicians and formal methods guys than me. And I was thinking, well, I don't know what I'm doing here, kind of thing. So,
Yeah.
and I didn't really enjoy the prospect of moving around all the time, having to take a contract here and move over there or whatever. I kind of just wanted to chill, and yeah, so I left and uh, went and did a bunch of other stuff. Basically, so long and short of it.
Yeah, and you published, I think, because I think you published a book about logic, or at least a history of logic. Is that?
Yeah, it's an edited collection, so I corralled all of the academics. It was actually after my PhD, in the summer after that, before I started working. I got really into the Aristotelian syllogisms, and
Mm,
it led me into this sort of so it's kind of the beginning of the history of logic, and everything. This
yeah.
big story then continues from there. And I just got a load of people in at the university I was in. We sort of put on a little lecture series where everyone did one lecture, and we covered all these different periods. So it was a fun little project, and then we just ended up like getting some. Some people wanted to not contribute their lecture to the book because they didn't think they were expert enough. So we got a load of like more internationally recognized sort of experts in the history of logic to contribute, like Stoic logic and stuff's really obscure.
Yeah,
So
cool.
um, yeah, and we put all of that together and turned it into a book. So that was quite fun. I still get royalty checks for it every now and
Oh
again. Every
yeah.
time it comes through, I'm like, whoa, royalties, sweet. I wasn't expecting that.
Yeah. Did the book turn so the book did pretty well?
I mean, it's an academic book, so it's probably only ever bought by like libraries or whatever. I mean, maybe some people buy it now because they see me on YouTube or something, but it's probably vastly overpriced for the type of it's like one of these academic press books. So
Yeah.
uh, yeah, I don't know if it like did well or something. But I just get that because it's a generic history of logic textbook.
Yeah. Also, people in the audience are probably going to be interested in this because you have a paper with. I'm pretty sure that I'm not sure if this is forthcoming or if it's come out, but you have a paper with Dr. Daniel Linford where you basically say that well, the Grim Reaper Kalam argument is an argument for nobody because like both Humeans and non-Humeans have like pretty good objections to it.
Well, yeah, that's the idea. Was so that well, maybe we want to get into that when we start talking about the Grim Reaper later. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
that's right. It seems to me that there's one premise in Kuhn's version of the argument that you have to be a Humean to buy, and there's another premise that you have to be an anti-Humean to buy, and like
Yeah.
plausibly nobody can be both of those at the same time. So
Yeah.
hence the
Okay.
argument for no one idea.
Yeah, great. Okay, so yeah, let's get started here. So, I mean, we're talking about cosmological arguments. I mean, of course, there is truly no such thing as the cosmological argument because there are just so many. There are so many different types. But roughly, what they all try to do is they argue in some way from some feature of the world in relation to whether it be causation or explanation to there being like a first cause or a source of reality or a necessary being or something.
Yeah.
And they're often used for theism in some way, you know, maybe to be developed with further arguments. I'm not too concerned about them as arguments for theism. I'm more so concerned whether they succeed as arguments for necessary beings or first causes.
Hmm.
And I will just say, to get my biases out of the way, that these arguments all strike me as almost extremely unconvincing. But but it's still, I think, well, it's very useful to like talk about them and like get all of the objections and all of the defenses of them.
Yeah, I broadly agree. I mean, I think they're interesting, and I haven't got like I think just like you said, then if it doesn't mean if you like these arguments that you all of a sudden have to start going to church and change your lifestyle or anything. It could just as easily show you something that you take to be true without it meaning you have to change your life or something. So I don't think I've got like this really over the top bias, that sometimes you hear that apologists will accuse anyone who's not a Christian of just like wanting to live in their sin or something. I mean, I think you could accept some of these types of arguments. Like I think there are people who just think that reality must have a sort of ground level to it for grounding reasons. They think that notion, metaphysical grounding, through analysis, it's quite similar to a cosmological argument. Shows you that they can't go on level after level forever without terminating somewhere. And in fact, it's kind of a common sort of notion from like folk science as well, that you think there's a theory of everything, and we'll find this elusive atom in the kind of Greek sense, where it's like the unbreakable little unit of matter or something. And in a way, that would be this kind of ground level thing that everything else kind of depends upon. So contingency arguments, yeah, they could be used just to establish something kind of neutral like that. But typically, through the history of philosophy anyway, they've been marshaled to prove that God exists. I mean, that's Leibniz's. I think Leibniz is probably the first person to come up with the contingency argument, and which is kind of a version of the cosmological argument. And that's obviously to prove that God exists. Although now I've said that out loud, I guess St. Thomas Aquinas, the some of the ways, I can't think of all of the ways off the top of my head and which ones count as cosmological arguments, but presumably the argument from motion is basically a cosmological argument. He's certainly where a lot of these guys get this idea of the like essentially ordered versus accidentally ordered causal chain. Maybe I'm jumping around here. Uh, did you want to sort of structure this a bit? So should we introduce
Yeah.
the argument more?
But before we start with the contingency argument, I wonder, like, some people often say stuff like, well, you know, various like Islamic scholars, like, Ibn Sina al-Hazali, um, maybe they developed arguments like this. I don't know where, like, temporally where they would lie between like Aquinas and others. I don't know if they'd be before or after.
Well, now you're asking me. So there's like Ibn Sina or Avicenna and Averroes. I think Averroes comes a bit earlier and Avicenna comes a bit later. But if
Yeah.
I'm not wrong, they're either both precede Aquinas, or maybe one of them comes a little bit after. But generally speaking, the um, the story of that is that after the fall of like the Roman Empire and this kind of Greco-Roman learning declines in the West, in Europe, but it's kept alive in the Islamic world. So 700, 800, 900 AD, that type of period. And then I think it's with the Islamic conquests that not only are they taking over bits of territory, but that's also introducing like cross-cultural exchanges in like Spain and stuff. And that they have copies of Aristotle and things, and that gets brought back into the Christian world where it gets picked up, and that's like basically um, what happens around the sort of 10th, 11th century, and this is where you start getting people like St. Anselm and Thomas Aquinas and stuff, and they are scholarly in part because they've been reintroduced to this Greco-Roman standards by the Islamic thinkers I can't go into the detail about the individuals because I just don't know it off the top of my head anymore. But yeah, those guys. And I think Avicenna is credited with being one of the early guys that's pioneering this Kalam cosmological argument, because obviously the word Kalam is an Arabic word, which I think just means something like learning or teacher or something kind of neutral like that. But it's a version of a cosmological argument that's specifically related to temporal sequences. So it's not grounding like we were mentioning before. It's more like sequences of events going back in time or whatever.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So let's talk about the contingency argument for a bit. Then
Mm-hmm.
there are different versions of the contingency argument. Like there are these like modal versions that like Dr. Josh Rasmussen and Alexander Pruss have discussed recently. But I'm more interested in kind of the generic sort of Leibnizian one that maybe like Kuhn's has also published about, but not like too recently. So I guess like I'll just say like the general idea of this, and I want you to kind of like go into detail on what this argument is. But I think roughly the idea is supposed to be that we have some explanatory principle that says something like every contingent fact has an explanation, something usually it's called like the PSR. Okay, and then we have some way of like taking like all contingent facts and like smashing them together and then saying like whatever that thing is, that's also a contingent fact and it must have an explanation. But by stipulation, this is the combination of all contingent facts. So it couldn't be explained by another contingent fact. Maybe that'd be circular. So the explanation would have to be necessary. So there's a necessary being, something like that. So maybe go into more detail about it.
Yeah. So I think the original kind of Leibnizian version is like a trilemma, where this would be familiar to you because it's going to be similar to a kind of epistemological version of the same type of thing, where you're thinking, well, here's a contingently true proposition, right? That like um, this has got two AirPod headphones in, or whatever, right? It does, but it needn't do. One of them could have fallen out a minute ago. So you can say, well, why is it the case that it's got both headphones in? And something explains that, right? There's some antecedent conditions that explain why that's the case. And then you can ask the same question about those antecedent conditions. Well, are those contingent or are those necessary? You're going to find that they're contingent. It's going to be something to do with my actions prior to lifting them up or something, right? And so you can just say the same thing. Well, what about, did those things need to be the case or not? No, they're contingent. So they must have been caused or explained by some antecedent conditions themselves. And it just initiates this kind of chain where you think like you must go back, the explanations sort of go backwards in time and recede off into the distance. And then you can ask yourself, well, what's going on here? It doesn't seem to be that many possible options. Either that chain just recedes forever and everything has just got some other thing that explains it, and it's just like turtles all the way down, or it comes to a point where it stops, where there's just some turtle that all of the others are standing on, and it's not standing on anything, or maybe there's some kind of circle or whatever at some point, right? But geometrically almost, what are the other options going to be? It's because you can maybe cook up some other version, but they'll plausibly just fall into being examples of those types. So then the question is just, can we knock out two of those options to leave a third one in place? And I take it this is Leibniz's strategy. So he's going to undermine the idea that it could recede off into the distance forever. This is where you get this kind of generic worry that resurfaces in all of these contingency arguments about whether or not you can have chains of dependency that just go on without there being a kind of first cause at the base of it. And the circle one, I mean, we can just knock that out. It just sounds like, I mean, let's just intuitively think through, like, does it make sense for there to be sort of circular explanations? And I think everyone feels like there's something wrong with that. Like if I don't know, I mean, in one sense, what does it even mean if we're talking about antecedent conditions? Then time itself has to circle round or something for them all to be antecedent and circular at the same time. So I don't know. No one really likes this circular option. Everyone's really happy to just drop that at the sort of slightest of objections to it, right? Explanations can't be circular. At least genuine explanations can't be circular, right? And it can't be self-referential. Nothing can explain itself. Contingent things at least can't explain themselves. That just feels like a cop-out. And then I suppose when we think about the option where there's a terminal point, well, then we could split that into two types, because it could terminate in a contingent thing, it could terminate in a necessary thing. So we can worry about what it means to terminate in a contingent thing on the basis that, like, well, we have this intuition in the first place that some contingent fact, like my headphones both being in there, cries out for explanation. And there's something wrong with just saying, well, maybe it just is, right? There's no explanation for it. Doesn't feel right. Contingent things like that just typically, well, not typically, exclusively, all the time, they do have explanations. Something explains why that's the case, right? And it would be weird if we found at the base of all of reality, there's just some contingent fact, that's not got any deeper explanation. So generally, people and philosophers throughout history have felt very uncomfortable with the idea of just going, well, it's a brute fact and there's nothing else to be said about it, right? So brute fact just meaning, in this context, a contingently true proposition that doesn't have any explanation for it. It's just there without explanation. And that just leaves terminating with a necessary base or receding off forever into the distance. And that seems to be where the most interesting bits of philosophical dispute comes in, right? Like, is there a problem with the idea of it receding off forever into the distance? If there is, if you could establish that, then given that we've knocked out all of the other options, you can kind of just conclude that it must be that there's a necessary item at the base of this contingent chain, right? That's the base of this broad outline. So then we're going to say something like, could there be like a train where it's, like a train where sometimes the engine's at the back and it's pushing it forwards, right? Just imagine that, but it's infinitely long. And that means that there isn't really a beginning, a first engine at the back, which is pushing all of the others forwards. And therefore, the idea is supposed to be the train couldn't be moving then, because nothing's like giving it its original impulse and giving it its energy to move forward. This is really Aquinas's argument from motion, which is basically Aristotle's argument from first causes, right? Now it's an appeal to an intuition, and that's basically all we've done so far with knocking out these other options. But trying to be a bit more forensic about it, it would be nice if there was something a bit more concrete to hang your hat on here and say, like, is there a contradiction? Does the idea, the very postulation of a beginningless train of carriages, is that in itself kind of contradictory? Because if so, that would enable us to feel confident knocking out this option. And my view about it is that it's difficult to provide a plausible looking candidate for a contradiction, and rather it seems to me what happens is it's like there's this subtle sort of shift where, on the one hand, you often find people saying things like, I kind of just did it then, like, imagine a train where it's only got a finite number of carriages, and at the back there's an engine that's pushing them forwards. And then basically the thought experiment makes you try and think about that very same train, but just taking the engine away. And then just like, well, that finite series of carriages, now it doesn't have an engine. That obviously isn't going to move, right? That just seems clear. And then I think there's this kind of subtle thought that, well, what goes for that must go for the series that goes on forever into the past, right? And I think that's where I want to say that there's something close to a sort of fallacious move there, right? And the difference is just that, like, I could agree, like, what's wrong with a finite series like that? If you remove the first one, is it seems clear, like I can understand why the train carriages could never move. But in the case where it's a beginningless series of train carriages, I still feel like I've got this explanation to hand, which is like, well, why does this train carriage move? Well, it's because the one before it is kind of pushing it. And why is that one moving? Well, it's because the one before that is pushing it. And I can always explain the motion, like local instances of its motion, in terms of just the train carriages that come before. Or I could maybe say, why does this train carriage move? Because of the infinite chain of train carriages prior to it that are pushing it forwards. And for each train carriage, I can appeal to the kind of section of the infinite preceding train carriages as pushing it along, right? It just feels like that's not as intuitively obvious, as if I just have a finite, like 3 train carriages and I just remove the engine. Because now I can see why that won't move, but I kind of can't see, like it doesn't strike me as the same. And just in going from this one example to the other one, I just think, no, that's not enough. I need it to be clearer than that for it to be uh, like more rigorous and more compelling. Um, so I guess what I'm appealing to here is this. It's this thing that's sometimes called the Hume-Edwards principle, right? And you can find it in Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion. There's a bit where, confusingly, I think it's Cleanthes who says this, even though he's one of the theists. This is a dialogue between 3 people, so it's like a trialogue. One of them is a skeptic, one of them is a Christian, and one of them is a kind of deist or something, a kind of non-specific theist. And it's that one who makes this objection. But anyway, the idea is supposed to be that you know if so let's take a set of propositions like P, Q, R or something, and if I like explain P and I explain Q and I explain R, then this Hume-Edwards principle is going, well, at least sometimes that's all there's to be done, right? There's no, like if somebody says, well, you've explained P, you've explained Q, and you've explained R, but you haven't explained the set P, Q, and R, then the Hume-Edwards principle is sort of gesturing towards this intuition that like there's nothing else to say, bro. Like I've explained the contents of the set. Asking for the explanation for the whole set over and above like the conjunction of those explanations is just asking, just got a vacuous question. Like there isn't a distinct additional explanation to those things. Like if the set was like, one of the P is like that my headphones exist, and Q is that this is a glass of water, and R is that we're having a conversation. Just fully explaining those things, it would feel weird that those arbitrarily selected 3 items should somehow have a distinct explanation over and above the explanations of each of the 3 things there. So I mean, to me, I quite like the Hume-Edwards principle. It seems pretty good, at least when you first hear it. So before I crack on into the Leibniz rebuttal, this stuff is familiar to you. I take it you're familiar with this stuff already. I'm not telling you something that's brand new, right?
Oh yeah, although like I can't say like I mean I know that there have been a few objections to the Hume-Edwards principles. I'm not familiar with the literature on the specific objections to it. But I do want to make sure I follow this. You're roughly saying that so even if you accepted like the naive version of the PSR, so even if you accepted that every contingent fact has an explanation, so then maybe one alternative is, okay, well so that's true, but there isn't like a terminating member of the chain. And then if somebody raises the question, well, how do you explain the totality of the contingent facts? You appeal to this principle and you say, well, there isn't any need to explain the totality insofar as every individual fact has an explanation.
That's basically the idea. It's that, yeah, there certainly seems to be cases anyway where some set of things explaining just the individual items one by one is enough, and asking for an additional explanation seems weird. That seems certainly in some cases. Like I'm trying to cook up
Yeah.
some arbitrary collection of things. It feels weird that they would have some third thing over and above the conjunction of their explanations. Yeah, that's right. So then the point would be though. So you followed it exactly right. That's exactly what I was saying. So now so there are some objections, of course, and then famously Leibniz, and this is a bit confusing with the timeline because we see Leibniz comes before Hume. Whatever, Leibniz already anticipated this sort of thing, and so it's sometimes called like the Leibniz's book objection. So he has this example of imagine there was a book, and every year scribes get the old copy of the book and they make a translation. They make a copy of it, and so you've got a new version for this year, kind of thing. And let's just suppose, for the sake of the argument, that it's like the Gospel of Mark or something, and they're just copying that forever. And then let's also suppose that that's been going on for an infinite amount of time, every year, for an infinite amount of time. There's generations of scribes have done the same thing. Well, okay, you can sort of appeal to the Hume-Edwards principle of like, how come this book is the Book of Mark? Well, it's because last year's one was the Book of Mark. And how come that one was the Book of Mark? Well, because the previous one was. I feel like I've explained everything, right? But now Leibniz wants to say, well, how come it wasn't the Gospel of John instead of the Gospel of Mark, right? You can sort of explain each instance of Mark, but you can't explain something maybe we call it like the global fact of how come they're all marked instead of just how come this one's marked, right? So Hume-Edwards' principle seems like it provides only kind of local analysis, and what we want to have is something like a global explanation of what's going on. It seems to me the most compelling like pushback at this point, and that's capturing, I think,
Yeah.
what you were saying before as well, isn't it?
Yeah. Now I'm curious though, like, so maybe like you accept if you could accept the PSR and accept the Hume Edwards principle. There are some objections, like you mentioned, but like if this is a view you could accept, and then maybe you would, that would prevent the inference to a necessary being. Um, there oftentimes a lot of people raise objections to the PSR itself, and the PSR strikes me as probably false. But aside from my view, like, what do you think about the PSR and then some of the arguments for it?
Well, just like cosmological arguments, there's not just one thing that's the PSR. There's lots of different versions of it as well. So some of them will be more plausible than others. But if we take a kind of strong version of the PSR, so that's a principle of sufficient reason, that's going to say something like, for every contingent thing, there's an explanation for that, and
Yeah,
what counts as an explanation will be provided by your statement of what the PSR is. So the strongest version will be something like, it's antecedent conditions that logically entail the thing. So it's like a kind of classic old school account of causation where the necessary and sufficient conditions just like
yeah,
inevitably give rise to the thing itself. If you have that version of the PSR and you think that every contingent thing has an explanation, so it's kind of universally applied with strong logical entailment as the notion of explanation, then I think you run into this issue that there's sometimes called like modal collapse, where
yeah,
well, so let's see. The problem is supposed to be that like if I suppose the additional assumption is that the totality of contingent things is a contingent thing, something to be explained, right?
yeah,
So that's what Leibniz's book is trying to. It's the intuition pump to try and get you to think that the totality of contingent things is itself a thing that requires explanation, and the combination of those, the strong PSR as I just outlined it, and the view that the totality of contingent things is a contingent thing, means that you run into this modal collapse idea, which
yeah,
means like basically nothing can be contingent whatsoever. And the idea is just straightforwardly that like if from something being necessary, like its logical consequences are also necessary. Like
yeah,
put it in the logician's term, we'd say something like uh, that like that logical consequence is closed under necessity or something. Right? So
yeah,
anything necessary, anything that's logically any logical consequence of that necessity is also necessary.
hmm,
But that just means if everything, the totality of contingent things must have an explanation, right?
yeah,
Then you can't appeal to anything that's contingent doing that work. It has to be coming from something that's necessary. But then
yeah,
any necessary consequence of anything necessary is itself necessary. So all of a sudden we don't have any contingency. It was just an illusion that anything was contingent because
yeah,
everything must be this way, right? So if if that's how, I mean, and then the difficulty there is supposed to be that like the first, like very first premise of this argument was there's some contingent thing like my AirPods being in their case or something, but actually no, there isn't because nothing's contingent, right? Contingency is a complete illusion.
yeah,
And then, so it sort of undermines the argument, right? You can't really state the argument because the first premise is false now. You see,
hmm,
you don't want your principle of sufficient reason to be so strong that you can't actually make the contingency argument at all, right? That seems to be the problem, like at least for someone who's trying to make the argument, right?
Okay, so you're basically saying, so I mean, I know Peter Van Inwagen had an objection like this. I don't know if it's
Yeah,
original to him. So
I think
suppose like,
Russell came up with it before him, but
ah,
Inwagen made it like more famous. Yeah, but
okay,
yeah,
that's good to know. So you're saying like, okay, suppose that there is this collection of all contingent things, and suppose that that itself is a contingent thing.
mm,
Okay, well, by that supposition, if it has an explanation by the PSR, then its explanation is necessary.
yeah,
But if explanations logically entail the fact that they're to explain, then that would mean that that very fact that we thought was contingent or supposed was contingent previously couldn't actually have been different, and so it's also necessary. So then we
Yeah.
have modal collapse. Okay, so then it seems like maybe this notion of explanation is no good. So then what other notions of explanations can like fix the problem?
Well, you can play around with different notions of explanation. Of course, you can have a weaker notion of explanation. So you could say something like, I mean, explanation in science isn't really as strong as this notion we just came up with, where it's logical consequence. I mean, say somebody contracts lung cancer, and they were a heavy smoker, right? Well, clearly you want to say something like the fact that they smoked 40 cigarettes a day for 20 years explains why they've now got lung cancer. But it's not true that smoking even 40 cigarettes a day for 20 years entails that you're going to get lung cancer. It's still contingent. I mean, like the way that the cancer metastasizes or whatever is not it's not a simple line between do this and you get cancer. It's do this and you raise your probability of getting cancer. So it seems like it's a very solid type of scientific explanation. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a good explanation. We don't want to make a notion of explanation that's so strong that it means that these types of things don't count as explanations, you might think, right? But that just severs this very strong relationship between the explanation and the thing that it's explaining, reduces it from logical consequence to something else, right? And then the question is
Yeah.
just, well, what is that something else relation? I think it gets just basically completely messy, and it's not like I don't think maybe you can come up with some version of this, right? Alexander Proust has a book that's basically entirely about this question, and frustratingly as hell, he doesn't define explanation. It's a really annoying paragraph in the first chapter where he says something like, I'm just not even going to try giving you like necessary and sufficient conditions for what counts as an explanation. It's just a kind of concept that we all get and appeals to some Wittgensteinian idea of something or other. And it's like,
Mm.
well, at that point, I'm like, the whole book became quite boring because I'm just thinking, well, the key concept here that I need to wrap my head around is like sort of hidden from views off stage or something.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think I mean, yeah, there's like, and what that means is there's basically just like a million different ways you could go, because it's in his book on infinity, Graham Oppy has a nice chapter at the end about principles of sufficient reason, and he lists about 15 different versions of what you might have as a principle of sufficient reason, starting with like the very most strong version, and then
Yeah.
like weakening different parts of that definition to cascade out all the different accounts that you might have. So I don't know that I've got a knockdown argument that shows you that like all of them suffer from something as clean and decisive as the modal collapse. It's just like the ball is back in the court of the person who thinks that there's an account to be used. And I think if you're sort of skeptical about it, I think we're just sort of, well, let's see what are you going to come up with and how is it going to work.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess there might be some worry that I'm not going to be able to explain properly right now about them. Maybe you can say something about like if they're too weak, then if they're too weak, then you won't be able to get to that kind of trilemma that we started with in the first place. But
Yeah.
forgive me for not off the top of my head being able to cash that out. I guess that's going to be something like the worry that you wouldn't be able to formulate the argument if it's too weak, but you can't formulate the argument if it's too strong either.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's this other issue with like non-entailing explanations, which is like, okay, whatever an explanation is supposed to be, whatever it is, it's supposed to be something that's mystery removing in some way.
Mm.
So if like there's something
Yeah.
that's like kind of mysterious to you, what the role of an explanation is, it removes the mystery. Now suppose like we take this idea of a non-entailing explanation seriously. And of course, like the way we use the word explanation in like a colloquial sense or even in science, it doesn't strictly need to be entailing. But you can question whether this is like a really robust metaphysical idea of explanation. Because if I have a set of facts and let's say they strongly predict, you know, probabilistically cause some other set of facts, but they don't entail it perfectly, then I can still like sensibly ask, well, hold on, well then to whatever extent the facts aren't entailed, why these facts as opposed
Yeah.
to the other possible facts, and there's still this mystery. And I think that no matter what your notion is, if it's not entailing, then you will always have a mystery like that. And then it seems like, to the extent that to which explanations aren't entailing, maybe those facts are just still in a sense unexplained.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's absolutely right. So I suppose that's the probably the Achilles heel in this. Any attempt to weaken the PSR leaves something unexplained. Yeah. Yeah, but let's also note that once we've gone towards this notion of like reducing mystery, not only does it become kind of vague and wishy-washy, but also it becomes subjective and like first person. Like what's
Oh
mysterious
yeah,
to me might not
yeah,
be mysterious to you, and like who cares about that? It just feels like a sort of psychological report about my mental state when you describe things to me. I mean, like it's
yeah.
it's it's not metaphysical at all, and so it does seem like it'd be difficult to see that there'd be um, that there would be some basis of a cosmological argument based on like personal feeling of mysteriousness or something, right?
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah, okay. So there certainly needs to be more serious philosophical work on the notion of explanation. You know, we talked about earlier how, like, this idea that take all of the contingent themes, put them together, that is supposed to be like a contingent theme that needs to be explained.
mm,
Some people worry about like whether or not that's even coherent. So I mean,
mm,
um, I think like Christopher Tomaszewski had an objection to Van Inwagen's argument from the PSR to modal collapse, where basically he said the problem with this argument is that it assumes that there is such a thing as like the big conjunction of contingent facts, and there actually couldn't be such a thing on pain of contradiction. And then he gives an argument that's very similar to Patrick Grimm's argument that there is like
right,
no set of all propositions. So,
right, like a
what do you think
Cantorian
about that?
argument. Yeah, I'm quite sympathetic to that in the Grimm case for sure. Yeah, it does seem to be just straightforwardly the case that well, I mean, it's very, very problematic to think that there's just a set of all truths. Um, that doesn't on its own get you the thought that there couldn't be a set of all contingent. It could still be the case, even if there's not a kind of ultimate set of all truths, that there could be a subset of that, which is all of the contingent truths.
Yeah.
Um, but I think what this does, so I don't know. I don't know the details of the argument that says that there couldn't be any. I mean, if it, do you have the argument to hand? I mean, it might be fun to have a look at it, but don't worry if you don't.
Yeah. I mean, I don't. I have I have the argument, but I don't know how I don't know if I can share my screen here. So
Well, don't worry about it. I mean,
yeah.
I think what you can you certainly have to have like a kind of like what the modal collapse thing shows you is that you can't have both the strong PSR and the thought that all the conjunction of all contingent things is itself a contingent thing, right? You can't have both of those. You could have neither of them, and you could have either of them on their own, but they're like kind of an unsatisfiable pair if you want to put it in that term. And I think that's just like relatively well established. Um, so Joe Schmidt and I published a couple of things over the last few years, and one of them was directly on this issue, right? So is it right to pivot from that
Yeah.
into
Yeah. Absolutely.
okay, great. So what we're doing in that paper was appealing to this sort of model of metaphysical possibility. So just take a step back, I suppose. Uh, so philosophers have this like logic of possibility called modal logic, which is developed in the 20th century, and it's like normal classical logic, but you introduce a couple of new operators, a couple of new symbols that you can prefix propositions, expressions with, like possibly whatever, possibly p, and necessarily, and because obviously there are some intuitive inferential patterns that of Aristotle just after Aristotle, developers of his syllogistic logic introduced modal terms to that too. So there's a kind of modal syllogism where you introduce a kind of square of opposition where you can see things like, if it's necessarily P, then it's not possible that not P. And if it's possible that P, then it's not necessarily not P. Kind of like you can see this structure of interrelations between basic modal notions just by, without any philosophical work, just kind of like knowing how the words function. And that became vastly more sophisticated in the 20th century as logic became more mathematical, right? And so these big systems of modal logic were developed. So you probably heard of like things like S5 and S4 and this type of thing. And there's vast amounts of complexity in the gradients between them. And there's a range of them that extends beyond. It's like S1 through S whatever, I can't remember, even 15 or something in the original work by C.I. Lewis. Anyway, around the kind of 50s, logicians were competing with one another to try and come up with a formal semantics for this, so that they could more readily prove metalogical properties of these systems, like completeness in particular. And basically, it's a fun story that there's a teenage Saul Kripke, I think he was like 17 or something, just a kind of bewilderingly brilliant genius who on his own was reading Tarski and Arthur Pryor and stuff, and just like understanding it and improving upon it and things, right? Writes this letter to Pryor. Arthur Pryor is a logician at Oxford in the 50s and 60s. Writes a letter to him to say that in one of his most recent papers, in like the Journal of Symbolic Logic, right, that he'd made a mistake, and he was just pointing out to him, "Oh, you misunderstood the consequences of Tarski's lemma and blah blah blah." And by the way, I've been thinking about this semantics, and outlines in a sort of diagram at the bottom this idea he has. And he goes on to like make this into a more rigorous theory, improves a famous completeness theorem for S5, which is kind of the sort of simplest of these modal logics. But the point I'm getting to is that it introduces this semantic notion of like possible worlds, because it's kind of like in his mind, a possible world is just you get all of the atomic propositions of your logic, and for each one of them, you assign it a truth value. And so you can think of this as a function that assigns truth values to propositions. And what it does is it makes sure that every single proposition has a truth value, and no proposition has more than one truth value. So that sort of maximal and consistency condition that's put on there, which, by the way, is basically just the principle of non-contradiction and the law of the law of non-contradiction and the law of excluded middle is basically what we're saying. There's no gaps where some proposition doesn't have a truth value, and there's no gluts where the same proposition is both true and false. Right? It's just sort of classical evaluation of those. As long as you've done that and you've specified for every proposition, then you've specified a possible world. You've specified exactly the truth and falsity of every question in that possible world. And then the logical consequences of that just sort of spill out using classical logic. So he's saying that once you've got that as our notion of possible world, which is basically just a kind of, it's really what Wittgenstein was doing earlier on, but whatever. Don't let me ramble on too much about the details of the history of logic, because I can keep talking like this for absolutely ages. But the idea here anyway was that he's introducing these models of how to prove stuff about modal logic, which requires you entertaining things like possible worlds. And then later on, it's given a really radical metaphysical gloss by David Lewis, who comes along and starts to say, well, I'm going to take these things as like not just being the logician's kind of collection of propositions with a function or whatever, really abstract notion like that, but I'm going to think of them as like concretely existing universes, just like this one, that exist in somewhere out there, right, in a wider notion of universe than pretty much anyone else had come up with previously, right? So it's a really wild, ambitious metaphysical program. It's cool. It's really cool as well. Reading David Lewis is like fun. Anyway, so that became the dominant notion of what possible worlds were, how to model modality. But actually, right back at the beginning, Kripke's idea was more about things like possibilities being like possible futures rather than possible worlds. So it's like in the actual world, you're thinking there are like ranges of things that can happen. And that's where the multiplicity comes in of the different ways things could go. That was his original sort of metaphysical idea and picture that was informing all of that work that he did. And in Naming a Necessity, I think he still has a bit where he talks about like rolling dice and drawing out the tree of all of the different possible combinations of how you could roll them, as you might do at school, to think about what the probabilities are for rolling 2 6s or something. And that's informing what's going on. It's like a branching view of how the future could contain different possibilities in it. So me and Joe were going back to that idea, which is like super intuitive to a lot of philosophers, which is like people in this debate already, like Alex Proust, Rob Koons, Graham Oppie, loads of these people are instinctively drawn to this branching idea. And you can think about it in terms of like branching actualism. It's just one term that we can use to name this thought, where we just say there's the actual world, which is just a temporal sequence of events, right? And a possible world, every possible world overlaps with the actual world at some point in time. So there's like, it might be that that the actual world and this possible world are exactly aligned up until like I flip a coin, and then this possible world branches off in that direction. The actual world goes in, actual world goes in the head's direction. This possible world goes down tail's direction or something, right? But the key idea is that every possible world, in fact, any pair of possible worlds overlap at some point in time. It's not just that they overlap with the actual world, but every pair of possible worlds overlaps at some point. So if you go back far enough, there's some kind of trunk where they will meet each other, and then they're identical as you go back in time any further. So we've got that idea in mind. Now let's start something. If time has a beginning, then of course all of the possible worlds overlap, if nowhere else, then at the root, the actual base of the tree itself, right? So that's fine. That makes sense. Now let's think about what it's like if time doesn't have a beginning. Well, it's still the same idea for any pair of histories going through this tree. They'll overlap at some point with each other, but there needn't be one specific point where all of the histories overlap with each other. So it's just like it goes back forever, and it's always such that there's more and more branching moments as you go back in time, right? Now the thought is just that, like, if that's what you had in mind, when we circle back and start thinking about what the contingency argument says, right? Because we didn't really say anything about what our theory of modality was when we were talking about this a moment ago. We just left all of that completely open. But let's cash that out. So let's say I'm a branching actualist. Now I'm thinking about could the past be infinite, and what does the some random pop up on my screen for Norton antivirus? It can go away. Yeah, I'm a branching actualist. I'm considering like what the scenario where the past is infinite. Now, remember I told you about the Hume-Edwards principle, and we're thinking, well, if I explain every item in the set, then that's me done. Don't need to provide any further explanation. And then Leibniz came along and said, well, what about if there was this book that was being copied every day, right? And maybe each day I can explain why the previous one, it's the Book of Mark today because it was the Book of Mark yesterday. Book of Mark yesterday because it was a Book of Mark before that. So what we want to say is, what Leibniz wants to say is that, well, it could have been the Book of John, right, instead of the Book of Mark. It could have been that instead of always copying the Book of Mark, they could have always been copying the Book of John instead, right? So it was like a global alternative. Things could have been not just a bit different, different, but only if you go back as far as some point in time, at which point it becomes the same again, but like different all the way back, like a global alternative. Well, that is the sort of thing that the branching actualist view is just going to say that's not a possible world. Right? That's like a branch that's free floating on the side of the tree that doesn't actually intersect with all of the other histories as they do. And that just, on this view, that's just not a possible world. It might be kind of conceptually possible or something, but it's not metaphysically possible. Metaphysically possible means that there's some point in the past where something happened, and it's gone in this direction rather than that direction. So like metaphysical possibility in this for the branching actualist means kind of grounded in the actual world. It's not like David Lewis where we just happen to have a pluriverse of distinct concrete universes. It's like the actual world, and things in the actual world, maybe their causal powers are the things that give rise to the contingency, the different directions things could go or whatever. But if you buy that type of thing, then you basically can't, like, I think it's just sort of a neglected or underappreciated fact that if you're a branching actualist, you can't have a global alternative to the actual world. You can only have like differences that are basically local, and that just means that, like, why couldn't it have been the book of John instead of the book of Mark? Well, because that would be a global alternative. That's not a metaphysically possible world. So even though it seemed like a really good objection from Leibniz there, because it does seem like, well, maybe it could have just been that every day in the past was different to how it actually is. There's plausible theoretical commitments that you might have about what your theory of modality is. Just rule that out. So then the question is, if you want to insist that there could be a global alternative, now you've kind of got to rule out the branching picture, right? So, and that starts to, you can't just appeal to, well, don't you think every day could have been different? Like, I kind of do, but also I like this branching view. So you have to you have to take that away from me before I'm going to just give in to my intuition, right? And so their task now becomes a lot more difficult, because how do you like decisively rule out this picture of modality? I mean, I don't know. It seems nice. People like it. People who are theists and like feel the
Yeah.
tug of this view. So anyway, it's just an interesting kind of take on it, I guess, to combine the consequences of the branching view with the traditional cosmological argument, and the move from the Hume Edwards principle to Leibniz's book as the rebuttal.
Yeah, I kind of struggle, and it's kind of weird because this concern, just looking at like the overview of like academic philosophy, seems like almost idiosyncratic to me. And but like I kind of struggle to understand metaphysical possibility. Like to what
Uh-huh.
extent do you think like different so-called theories of metaphysical possibility? To what extent do you think they're like theories of like one common underlying theme versus just different conceptions or ways of using possibility like terms?
I mean, it's definitely a term of art that doesn't really have a natural counterpart in sort of normal language. Metaphysical possibility, right? It's a philosopher's term. Um, I think the origins of the term was it's just a really broad brush thing to just distinguish subjective or conceptual ideas of possibility and like objective ones. And it's just interchangeable with objective, metaphysical, meaning objective, meaning it's not in my head, it's in the world, right? So that all that does is like say it's not a subjective account. But then there are, if we want to think about non, agent centric versions of, because the possibility comes in many grades. What's knowable is clearly going to be different from agent to agent. What's knowable to me might be not knowable to you, or what's
Yeah,
plausible to me might not be plausible to you, whatever. So there are obviously modal notions that require you to specify who it is that you're talking about when you say it. But we think there'd be a bunch of other modal notions that don't require that type of thing. Like what's physically possible. It doesn't matter
yeah,
if you're talking about me or you. What's physically possible is what's physically possible, or what's logically possible. So they're both metaphysical possibility if we just use it as a broad brush to mean objective. But then some philosophers, I don't know if this is right, but I think my temptation is to say that this comes about in terms of discussions of God and philosophy of
hmm
religion, but because it's quite natural to think that um, there's a range of things that God could do, not just things that I can imagine being possible, but you want to say that the
yeah,
things he really could do, like he could change the laws of physics to be different. So
yeah,
there's some notion of his power and his ability, some modal notion that goes along with that, which is kind of above physical possibility. Some people,
mhm.
and then it becomes kind of curious. I mean, is it above logical possibility? Could God have made it that law of non-contradiction is false or something? Maybe
Yeah.
that does.
I think Descartes held that view, maybe.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I
Yeah,
think that's right. Yeah. Although these questions of modality weren't understood anywhere near the right clarity at that point. But yeah, I think that's right. He does think that God could have made mathematical truths different. Yeah. Anyway, so uh, So we've got this like nebulous notion of metaphysical possibility being something that's above these normal or these other types of objective possibility, like physical possibility or realizability or something. That God's power calls for there being something else. It's very nebulous, though, and I mean, let's be clear. In Plantinga has this book called "The Nature of Necessity," and you'd think that would be a good place to go to find out what the nature of necessity was, right? Like they're answering this
Yeah.
question we've got. It's actually, I think, in the first line on page 1, where he says that it's really difficult to explain what necessity is, and you kind of just have to give examples to someone and hope that they
Mhm.
pick it up. You can't really
Yeah.
explain it any more than that. And it's like that's the most disappointing thing. Like page 1 of this book is supposed to be about the nature of necessity. What he ends up doing is gives a theory about possible worlds. So he's like a not a realist like Lewis. He has a kind of a more ontologically lightweight version. So he's giving you a theory about what um, the nature of possibilities is or something, but he's not giving you a criteria against which you can say, X is metaphysically possible if and only if. He doesn't fill in a biconditional like that. So we're just
Yeah.
left to wonder what that could be. And the branching view also doesn't fill that out by saying P is possible if and only if. What it does is provides a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition. So the necessary condition is just it's necessary if it overlaps with the actual world at some point. But that's not all there is to it, because it's still not quite clear on this view. Well, a coin flips the types of things, or is it like quantum interactions or whatever? I mean, we're not saying anything about that. All that's required is just to provide a necessary condition. So it's a partial explanation, a partial theory of modality, which just merely offers this as a necessary condition. The possibilities overlap with the actual world at some point.
Some philosophers say like so some a lot of them I think implicitly, but some just explicitly give this understanding of metaphysical possibility and necessity, where so there is this distinction between things that are narrowly logically true and things that are broadly logically true. So I guess like a narrow logical truth would be something like if you're, just like imagine the traditional like, syntax of like classical propositional logic, for example. So a narrow logical truth would just be, you know, sentences that take this strict form of logical truth. So like, P or not P, something like that. They have to take that strict form. But a broad logical truth need not take that strict form, but it just kind of has to be like analytically or conceptually true. So an example of a broad logical truth would be something like, well, every bachelor is married. Where if you were to translate that strictly into the language of first order logic, it's not going to be like a strict logical truth, but we want to say there's an intuitive sense in which, it's true by definition or conceptually true. And then I think
Mm.
Joshua Rasmussen, he just explicitly says by metaphysical necessity, we can just mean like broad logical necessity. I don't know how common of a view you think that is, but I've seen like some people go that way.
Well, so I think it might be that Rasmussen's going to say something similar to my view on this. Which so I think my on that specific question, I think it seems to me like this that there's a notion of logical possibility, right, which just means a bit like what you were saying, but it's basically anything that can be proved for just by assuming logic itself, right? So give me classical logic, and then I can prove a bunch of things. You don't have to tell me whether it's Monday or what any other contingent facts. I can already tell you that it's not the case that P and not P. I can prove that for you, right? Or but infinitely many other theorems, strictly speaking. And that's cool. So all of those count as logical necessities, um, and something's logically possible if its negation isn't a logical necessity, right? Um, but that's what we mean by logical possibility. Now, I think if you add in any non-logical assumptions and then calculate, now it's not logical possibility anymore, but that's just how you generate these other modalities. So, for instance, give me classical logic and um, like facts about physics, right? Like the laws of physics, where things are, blah blah blah, And now I can derive using classical logic a load of stuff, and we call that physics. That's the field of physics. It's just logical. It's just a bunch of assumptions about like there exist particles and there's a thing called mass and this is the equation that governs the interaction between blah blah blah. And then you actually just use classical logic to deduce things like if this particle's here and it's got this momentum and blah blah blah, then blah blah blah, and those things follow logically. It's not like a special logic of physics. Physics is just a bunch of assumptions you pack in to logic, and then you just do normal derivations, right? So all of the fields work in the same way. If you give me the same thing, tell me, specify an agent, give me all of the things he believes, I'll tell you what's epistemically possible for him using classical logic in the same way. So all that's going on is we're packing in additional things. Now, we just do the same thing. Give me the meaning of some non-logical term like bachelor, right? Give me a definition of that. Like it means it's a man who is not married or whatever. Well, now I can just use classical logic to substitute synonyms in the relevant place to build an actually logically deductive argument that really does just show you that if this guy's a bachelor, then he doesn't have a wife or whatever it is. And it's not that like there's this additional notion of, I mean, broad logical possibilities. It's just really terribly named. That's Plantinga's name, I think. Narrow and broad logical possibility goes back to him. It just seems an unfortunate thing. It's just logical deduction with some assumptions packed into it, right? That just seems like the cleanest way to understand all of this varieties of modality. It's just what are you adding to classical logic? Which non-logical assumptions are you packing in? So you might say, I think, do you know what? I think Rasmussen would agree with all of that. I think it's just not very controversial. And then I guess now you can come up with a version of what metaphysical possibility means, which is something like, well, to classical logic and maybe physics and blah, 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 whatever we've packed in anyway, I'm also going to add in some metaphysical truths like souls exist or time can only go forwards or whatever, right? That matter is indivisible, something like that. These the sorts of things that like typically taken to be metaphysical truths, and then they will affect what you can derive out of the consequences. Right? The more assumptions you pack in, it changes what the consequences that you can derive back out. So you get a novel notion of modality for every different combination of things that you can pack in. That's why it's hopeless to sort of say the notion of metaphysical possibility, because it's as broad as the range of things that you could introduce as a metaphysical idea. So in what me and Joe were doing was introducing an idea, metaphysical idea, which is about the overlapping of possible worlds with one another. And then a bunch of stuff follows, like there can't be a global alternative to the actual world. So you might pack in some stuff, God's super powerful and super nice, and then that becomes metaphysically necessary that he makes a lovely world for us to live in or something, right? So I think that's the most sort of, as I said, the cleanest and most productive way to carve up this landscape. Now, how does that strike you?
Yeah. I think mostly everything you said I agree with. So, I mean, that is generally how I tend to think about modalities. I guess like maybe the point of bringing it up was more so like I think so. There is this idea of a sentence or a proposition being conceptually true. Maybe it doesn't even have to be like you said. We can add like in addition to just like standard logical axioms or something, we can add like facts about um, the meaning of non-logical terms or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
or non-logical
Yeah.
symbols. So like it might not have to even be like baking in things about the definition, because like if we have terms that are primitive, maybe they don't have definitions, but there's a sense in which they have conceptual information that can still, once embedded into other sentences, generate truths that are conceptual, even if there's no definition to impact. But yeah, I agree that like adding something into those like logical truths, something like that is, one thought I find intuitive.
Mm-hmm.
But the larger point is supposed to be like there is this idea of an analytic truth or a conceptual truth. And then, there's also this other intuition that metaphysical possibility is supposed to be like this broadest idea of possibility, something like that. Some people say. Um, and, you know, I can't really imagine what I would be compelled to say is necessary in a really robust way that isn't in some way conceptually true like that. Now, sometimes people, have these idea that they're like a posteriori necessities and things like that. I think that is actually still going to fit under the idea I'm talking about. It's just that when it comes to the a posteriori necessities, the concepts at play are going to be kind of opaque. So it's a difficult view. I doubt most people will be sympathetic to the way I like to approach it, but
Well,
that's roughly the idea.
the a posteriori just is as a label that describes how it's known, right? So whether it's metaphysical or not, it should be independent of how you know it. And Kripke introducing the term because he's saying there are some you can know a posteriori some analytic truths. Wait, necessary a priori, is that the distinctive Kripkean combination? Analytic a priori? I can't even remember. It's been so long since I read Naming a Necessity. Whatever. I take your point, right? But I think that listen, I think what looking at you say metaphysical modality is supposed to be this like widest category, and I kind of said that as well before, that's where this comes from. But I feel like and it was Rasmussen who said this to me once, but it was like, the widest scope of possibility just seems to be like conceivability, because like I mean, depending on how you think about that, but like I can conceive of I can imagine, so let's say the law of non-contradiction is false, but if it's true, it's logically true, right? Trivially, because it's a logical property, right? So that just seems to say that like my imaginative capacity, the modality that you get if you follow along with where my imagination can lead, outstrips any of these categories, because I can just like picture, whatever you say is the thing that is the limit of my thought. I can just imagine thinking further on than that, right? And then there kind of can't be a boundary around which I can imagine, because I can always outstrip that. So Graham Priest calls it something like the enclosure schema or something, where it's like it's a bit like that Grimm argument about how there can't be a set of all truths. There kind of can't be a boundary around my imagination, because like tell me what that boundary is and I'll just imagine transgressing it and thereby have transgressed it in the relevant sense. So I think that
Yeah,
like
at least like your prima facie conceivability, maybe.
right, because then someone's going to say we're not really conceiving of it, right? But
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, but now we come into like, well, what do you mean? I've referred to it. My mind was directed towards that in a way that seems like, it just sounds like policing. And I'd want to know what was non-question begging about the criteria of really conceiving about it. Because if you say, well, you can only really conceive it if it's consistent or something, that just feels like it's question begging if we're talking about
Yeah.
conceiving the law of non-contradiction not being true. Or you can't really conceive of it if God isn't part of the thing that you're conceiving. Just seems question begging in the context of whether or not God exists, right? So
Yeah.
again, it's one of these things where like you kind of want there to be something that would bound this, but it's really difficult to see how they could be. Anyway,
Mhm.
it's a cool idea, and it's just a thought that like typically people will say metaphysical possibility, that's the thing, you can't go any bigger than that, or maybe logical possibility, you can't go bigger than that or whatever. But I kind of just think you can.
Yeah, I see. No,
Yeah.
I agree with you. That's an interesting thought.
Mm.
It's fun. Like we spent all this time. We had this great discussion about contingency arguments and like modality. Like now we have to like squeeze because we still have to. Okay, well, let's just try to move on here. Let's just get
Yeah.
into. We have to sort of squeeze in like the Kalam now.
Okay.
Okay, but like okay, the Kalam. I mean, the standard Kalam from William Lane Craig. This is like a classic apologetics argument, but it's like the whatever begins to exist has a cause.
Hmm.
The universe began to exist, so the universe has a cause.
Hmm.
Um, okay, so that means like okay, there are two premises. We can either deny one or both of them. So what do you think about the causal principle that whatever begins to exist has a cause? I mean, William Lane Craig has like some famous like arguments for it. I don't think those arguments are any good, but what do you think about the principle?
Well, look, in the interest of time, I think what you should do is get Dan Linford on and talk to him about the causal principle, because he's I would say, one of the world's like leading experts on that very question. His
Ah, okay.
PhD thesis was really about that very question. So,
Yeah.
in the interests of time, and because it's a good excuse to tell you to get Dan to come on and promote his work as well, maybe
Yeah.
we just skip that one and talk about premise two, because that's where I've focused all of my um, sort of academic attention on.
Okay,
Is
sure.
that okay?
No, yeah, I think that's a good idea. Okay, so the universe began to exist. Okay, so how about you give your thoughts on that premise?
Right. Okay. So then, with that, if we're talking about the kind of like now the kind of orthodox kind of Craigian way of setting out the stall for that, he says there's like a priori or metaphysical defenses of this claim that the universe began to exist, and there's scientific ones, right? And actually, if you want to talk about the scientific ones, then you should get Phil Halper on there, because he has a book just out which is about all these different cosmological models and the different accounts of the Big Bang and stuff. And he could walk you
Yeah.
through all of those in a really fun way.
Yeah, they
Um,
also had a survey where so they did this like study, I think what he has a physicist he has a physicist who works with him. I think the
that's
person's
right.
name's like Niash
Phil. Yeah.
Afshordi, and they
Mhm.
like surveyed these people at a conference, and then like apparently like a considerable majority said we shouldn't understand the Big Bang as the beginning of the universe, rather
Yeah.
something that yeah, it would be good to have them on.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me know. I'm friends with both of them. So if either of them, I'm sure they would both love to come on and talk to you about that stuff. But
Yeah,
um, it seems for my, and I'm not a physicist, so I'm not really an expert on that. But I can tell enough that there's no like completely uncontroversial consensus. As you said, this survey data seems to expose the fact that it's not even a majority view. Um, so I think relying on in any way, it's like a moving target. The state of cosmology is changing quite rapidly as we find out new things and stuff. So relying too heavily on these scientific arguments doesn't seem like a good idea to me.
yeah. You want to kind of like a priori argument. You don't want to like you know like put all of your eggs in one basket.
Yeah, right. But so if we forget about the scientific arguments and think about the a priori stuff, then Craig has two different arguments, right? So Hilbert's hotel argument and the successive addition argument. So the Hilbert's hotel argument just says something like uh, that. Oh, what are the premises off the top of my head? It's uh, uh, Christ. It's just a tiny syllogism with like two premises. Let me just like go and get it. Hold on a second. Jesus Christ, I'm too old to be doing these long podcasts where I have to remember everything. Uh, um, I don't know. I'm trying to read the internet really quickly. Uh, and
Although in the
actually,
meantime, everybody should. I mean, you have a podcast called Thoughtology. I think everybody should also watch that podcast.
that's true. That would be good. I'm trying to do more stuff on that channel as well at the moment. So I'm doing some like live streams and random things. So yeah, that would be good. Okay, Hilbert Hotel. Beginning a series of events is an actual infinite. An actual infinite is impossible. So beginning a series of events is impossible, right? Um, beginning a series of events is an actual infinite. Well, that it's kind of just uncontroversial. What an actual infinite means is really just that it's the number of things is at least equal to the number of natural numbers, so the cardinality of the natural numbers. Um, if the past is beginningless, then we can imagine like numbering each previous day and assigning each one a unique natural number. Yesterday could be one, the day before that can be two, etc., etc. And and then you can see my dog getting into her bed in the background, and it's quite cool. Um, so yeah, in that way, we can show that the beginningless sequence, a beginningless past, is numberable. Yeah, like so that it's obviously the same cardinality as the natural numbers, and that just means that it's actually infinite. That's all. That's all that Craig means anyway by it being actually infinite. Right, so it's kind of true by definition almost. It's like a mathematical fact. Um, but then the controversial premise is just that an actual infinite can't exist, and for that, the reason this is called the Hilbert's hotel argument is that just Craig points to the well-known thought experiment about there being a hotel with infinitely many rooms in. It's full because there's a guest in each room, but it can accommodate any number of new guests by just making the guests move around. Or you can have it that like all of the guests in room number 3 or above leave, so infinitely many of them leave, but there's only 3 left. And Craig says stuff like, well, that means infinite minus infinite equals 3 sometimes, but then if every even numbered guest leaves, then it's infinitely many minus infinitely many, but still infinitely many left. So he thinks there's kind of mathematical absurdities or whatever. So that's the Hilbert's hotel argument. And then do you want to pause on this one for a moment, or shall I just go through the successive addition argument as well?
Yeah, maybe go through the successive addition argument, then we can talk about both.
Right, so the successive addition argument is supposed to be like weaker because it doesn't rule out any infinite collections whatsoever. What it's doing is now saying that you can't make an infinite collection by this process of successive addition. All successive addition means is like adding one thing at a time, like counting or building a building by putting 1 brick on per day or something, right? And he thinks if you're doing successive addition, like any collection formed by successive addition cannot be actually infinite. That would be premise 1. And then premise 2 would just be like the past is a collection formed by successive addition, because like each day, one new day gets added to the previous set of days. See, I did that one off the top of my head without having to look it up, so that's good. That's good. Still got it. Yeah, right. So in that one, he appeals to like this kind of intuitive notion that if you try counting now, you'll never get to the end of the natural numbers, and that's enough to show you that you can't complete an actually infinite set by successive addition. And then he says, therefore, the past can't be actually infinite. So there are 2 different arguments to the same thing, which is supposed to be both that the past cannot be actually infinite.
Yeah, okay. And so obviously you don't think these arguments work. So what are the objections here?
Right. Well, the Hilbert's hotel. The main objection, really, with the Hilbert's hotel. There's so many. Right. I have often thought about writing a book about the various objections to both of these arguments, but the main one, the most gratuitous problem with the Hilbert's hotel argument, is that there's no contradiction. Even if you grant all of the premises of the argument, it's not showing that there's a. Well, I guess if you buy all of the premises of that little syllogism I gave, then it would rule out there being a Hilbert. But the point is that if we're just trying to support the premise of the Hilbert's hotel argument, which was that an actually infinite collection is impossible, just appealing to the kind of weirdness of the hotel and its behavior of being able to accommodate infinitely many guests or whatnot, all of those appeals, I think, have been conclusively shown to not generate an actual contradiction. And I think Craig's basically admitted that as well. It's not definitive. It's like thought experiment that gives you an intuition pump. Or I tried to say, I did a debate with Craig once and tried to get him to see that point. And I think he said something about it being like Cantor's paradise. There's this I think it's a Wittgenstein quote where it's like you can live in. He wants to drive you out of Cantor's paradise or something. He's basically like trying to say you can believe in actual infinities in the kind of mathematical realm, but they couldn't exist in the actual world, like the concrete world or whatever. But I mean, I just don't think that the Hilbert's hotel thought experiment conclusively shows you that. I kind of just, I mean, it's like a kind of Gestalt switch thing, but how else do you expect a Hilbert's like an infinite hotel to behave, right? It just would be like that. I mean, in particular, there's a kind of principle which says, it's sometimes called Euclid's maxim, but it's just basically that like the whole of something is always greater than the proper part of it, right? So there has to be more guests in, if you think about all of the rooms in the hotel, there's more guests in the totality of rooms than if you just consider how many guests there are in all of the even numbered rooms, right? And that principle is true for any finite hotel, any finite thing, really. This Euclid's maxim applies, but it just fails when you come to thinking about infinite sets. And this is because, as far back as Galileo, it's been known that you can pair the natural numbers with the even numbers, and that proves give a couple of other assumptions about what equinumerosity is and blah blah blah. But you can basically convince yourself that there's just as many natural numbers as there are even numbers, even though the even numbers is a proper subset of the natural numbers. It's violate
Yeah.
maxim. So it's just like you can't say, I think that if there was a Hilbert's hotel, I can just apply reasoning that blatantly assumes Euclid's maxim. Like that's just
Mhm.
obviously going to be some kind of like the problems. Like it's like a U problem if you do that. It's not a problem with Hilbert's hotel. What you should actually
Yeah.
do is realize that you obviously wouldn't be able to reason with anything that presupposes Euclid's maxim. But when you drop that, it's really hard to see how there's going to be a contradiction, right? Because
Yeah,
you
exactly.
can't say something like it's a proper subset but it's also equinumerous, and that's a contradiction because it isn't when you drop the Euclid's maxim. So there's loads of stuff like that where it just sort of dissolves on contact. I think the more you think about it, the less persuasive it is.
Yeah, and it's like, well, there's no contradiction in the scenario because, okay, given properties of infinity, it could be the case that all of the rooms are filled, yet I can add more people into the hotel.
Yeah,
So, okay, so there's no contradiction. So then it's like all you really have is like it's kind of counterintuitive. But
yeah,
loads of things are counterintuitive and still true. So there needs to be another reason to think that it's like false or much, not even just false because he's claiming it's impossible, like just because it's counterintuitive.
yeah. I mean, it's worse than that. It's not just such that there's things that are counterintuitive and true. It's that you should expect things that are very distant from your everyday experience to be counterintuitive. Like it's not even a mark against it. I'd be surprised if it wasn't counterintuitive, an infinite object. It would be weird in some way or another, right? It's like one of those Star Trek episodes where they encounter some being from the other side of the universe or whatever. I mean, it should be weird, otherwise it would be disappointing. It wouldn't fit in with my with my expectations if it didn't defy my expectations, right? Weird objects like that. So
Yeah.
just complaining that it's weird. It's like there's this a physicist, Paul Dirac, from like one of the pioneers of quantum theory. Super weird bloke, but when he would go, he was an Englishman, when he would go abroad to conferences, like in Czechoslovakia, and it would have like a different convention where when you go to the opera over there, you would be expected to take your hat off and hang it up in the dressing room or whatever outside. But the English tradition was that you take your hat with you and leave it on your lap. And he would just do the English tradition, even though he was in Czechoslovakia. He was just this like autistic guy who's just like, no, I'm going to do it my way. I don't care where I am, kind of thing. And that's what Craig is like when he's thinking about Hilbert's Hotel, because he's just like, no, damn it, I'm going to take my sort of parochial intuitions that have been gathered by observing finite concrete objects and just go, I'm going to just refuse to give them up when we're considering this like space age infinite hotel. And it seems to me that's what's generating the sense of weirdness in his head. And like, if you don't
Yeah.
do that, then it sort of goes away. So
Yeah.
yeah, Hilbert's hotel argument is terrible. It's a rubbish argument. It's fun to think about. There's loads of like cool nuances and stuff, and people still try and defend it. But as far as I'm concerned, it's like a
Oh,
game over.
people do try to. Oh well, there is. I mean, does Andrew Loke still defend it? Oh yeah, he does. He
Kind
came
of.
up with a new paper about it. Yeah.
He kind of defends it. He has a paper. He has a couple of papers on it. I mean, he has a couple of papers, a couple of books that sort of circle around this. But these days, a friend of mine pointed out that really, if you think about his argument, he says it's a hotel room builder argument,
Yeah.
which he describes as a new Hilbert's hotel argument. But actually, when you think about it, it's really just a version of the successive addition argument. So it's
Uh,
questionable whether he's even defending the Hilbert's hotel argument or if, in fact, he's defending the other argument.
well, it's a good
So,
segue because we want to talk about the successive addition argument now. So what are your thoughts
yeah.
on that one?
Okay, so this one I've been thinking about loads recently. So, like, with this one, it starts off with this thought that you can't, if you start counting now, so if we introduce this term like a count up, where I'm saying go like 1 2 3 blah blah blah, and I initiate this count up. You could say to yourself, well, what, obviously if I actually try that, I'll get bored after 3 or 4 seconds and stop doing it. I'm not going to devote the rest of my life to it. But even if I did, I'll die at some point, and there will only be some finite number that I get to. And even if I don't die, and like let's say when I die or whatever, you carry it on, and we keep going. At some point, the universe is going to expire or whatever. but let's just discard all of these stupid considerations. Let's just imagine what would happen if, I don't know, in heaven, I wake up and I've got an infinite future ahead of me, and I think I'm just going to count forever and just see what happens, right? Well, what would happen in that scenario? Well, what wouldn't happen is that I would like finish, because, and the reason to think that is that, like, even with an infinite future ahead of me, I'm still not going to complete this task. And just because, like, well, what is counting? It's just, I say a number, whatever the number is, and after that, I say the successor to that number. So like n plus 1 or whatever. And I just keep iterating that pattern, no matter which number I'm on. And the thought is just that, like, there'll always be a plus 1. Like, there's always a successor to any natural number. There's no natural number such that it's the end of the natural numbers. So it doesn't matter how long I do it for. I'm not gonna complete that task. I'm not gonna get to the end of it. There just is no end to it, right? So I think one useful way to think about it is in terms of like a sequence, right? So we could imagine like writing it down as like 1, 2, 3, ... Right? And when we introduce the ... that's to indicate that it's like an open end of the sequence. So we could use like I think it's Dedekind introduces this sort of symbolism where you have like an open, like a bracket, a curved bracket, meaning like an open end to a sequence like that, and like a square bracket, meaning a closed end where it's got like a first element in it. So we'd write like a square bracket and then 1, 2, 3, 4, ... and then we would have an open bracket on the other side, right? So that's one type of sequence like this that you could have that's closed at the beginning and it's open towards the end, right? Let's just, for the sake of it, there's like 4 different ways you could do this, because I could have it that it's closed at both ends. That's maybe like a count from 1 to 10, and that's just closed at both ends. Or it could be that it's open at the beginning and closed at the end. So that's one where it would be like the negative numbers or something, and they count down towards 1 or 0 at the closed end, but there's no like earliest negative number or something. And then it could be that it's open in both directions. So it's like beginningless and endless, and right. So there's no beginning or end to it. Now, if it's like if I'm in the middle of the last one where it's beginningless and endless, I'm still not going to get to the end because it doesn't have an end. So again, that's not going to terminate. If I've got one that's closed at both ends, and clearly I can get to the end of that because it's just like counting to 10. Now, the only version that Craig ever really looks at explicitly is this count up. And we agree we can't get to the end of that. But the interesting question, if what we're trying to prove is that the past has to be beginningless, can't be beginningless, it has to have a beginning, would be the last combination where it's open towards the past, but it's closed towards like the future. So like it terminates now or something. And even if you can't complete a count up, like what's the reason I can't complete a count up? It's just that there isn't a final integer for me to count. But if it's a count down, there kind of is a final integer that I can count to, right? Because it's going to be like 1 or something. I'm counting. So if you imagine like somebody counting backwards through all of the natural numbers, you can imagine him saying like 3, 2, 1. Okay, I'm done. And I'm walking off or something. And that scenario is weird. And just like we said before with the count up, it's not really physically realistic because someone would have died or got bored and blah, 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 blah. But like logically or something, is there any actual contradiction in supposing that somebody is finishing a countdown like that? And it seems to me that there's no difference between the two of them. I mean, supposing there's enough time, then somebody could be completing a countdown now, in the same sense that supposing there's enough time to go, somebody could be starting an endless count up now. Like you might start counting now and never end, and just keep going, right, forever. That might happen in some sense of might. And it's the same sense that means that somebody could be finishing a countdown, and neither of them have any contradiction to them. It's just that one of them can be completed, the other one can't be. And the asymmetry there is really just because, I just described it sort of mathematically almost with just these times of boundaries and blah, blah, blah. But like the thing that breaks the symmetry between them and means they're not exactly the same is that like there's a direction of completion which points from the past towards the future. right? So when I start counting upwards, the direction of me counting is like going towards the open end of that sequence. But with a countdown, the direction of completion is towards the closed end. So like clearly I can complete a beginningless countdown, but I can't complete an endless count up, right? So this seems to me the right way to think about it. And Craig's idea is that because you can't complete an infinite count up, well, that means that you can't complete an infinite countdown. But it's very unclear like when we were talking about the contingency argument in the first place, like it's, is it just like removing the first train? Is that the same as having a beginningless sequence of train carriages, right? Does it really carry forwards like that? In this case, I just think like I'll even agree that you can't complete a count up, but that's not enough to like show me that you can't complete an infinite count down. So you need to say something else. So this is sort of the first sort of version of this argument, which you can call like indirect defenses of the impossibility of an infinite countdown, because you just say, well, look, a count up is impossible, an infinite count up is impossible, therefore an infinite countdown is impossible. So an indirect way of getting there. And it just seems to me that no way of filling out the therefore, like some I think JP Moreland tries to say, well, look, there's the same number, right? So if you can't complete an infinite count up and an infinite count down has the same number of steps as an infinite count up, that's why you can't complete an infinite count down. But I just don't, it's just not a logical principle, right? And Wes Morriston has like the definitive takedown paper of this from like 2022. It's called like the Successive Edition Argument or something. It's in the Australian Journal of Philosophy, and probably on Wes Morriston's website. If you just Google him, or like most of his papers are just there free to read, and that's like the very best place you can go to find this sort of analysis being explained properly. So indirect defenses just seem hopeless from the start, because like there is no logical bridge that shows you that because you can't complete it, because you can't get to the end of the endless, that therefore you can't get to the end of the beginningless, right? Like it's just, when you put it like that, there's obviously not going to be some kind of, I'm not making some modal scope fallacy or something. It just doesn't follow, right? So indirect defenses are just sort of dead in the water, it seems to me. But then left is like direct defenses. And these are really rare. They're like hen's teeth or whatever, because hardly anyone tries this move out. It's a lot more difficult. Much rather just appeal to the intuitive impossibility of completing a count up and then calling it a day. So here what you've got to do is find something about the beginningless countdown, which is just itself means that it's impossible. So Craig gives it a go and tries to say something like, look, if somebody was finishing their infinite countdown right now, because the past is infinite, a bit like Hilbert's Hotel, you could kind of like shuffle all of their counting events down by one, and there would still be just enough, there'd be just, plenty to accommodate them all. So let's suppose that instead of finishing saying one today, he says one yesterday. Instead of saying two the day before that, he says two the day before that, or whatever, right? We're just shuffling all of those events down. And he's saying, well, he could have finished then. I mean, he could have finished yesterday. He could have finished the day before. He could have finished at any time. So it violates the principle of sufficient reason, because nothing can explain why he finishes today rather than at some other day. Well, we're just back to the cosmological argument again, because well, what explains why he finishes today? Well, I'll give you two things that entail it. One of them is yesterday he was saying two, and the other one is he counts at the rate of one number a day. There you go. Now it logically entails that he's saying one today. You're going, well, that's not very satisfying, because, well, how come he was saying two yesterday? Well, I'll give you two facts that entail it, right? He was saying three the day before, and he counts at the rate of one number a day. So I'm giving you this like Hume Edwards thing, where I'm just explaining the previous thing. I'm explaining one thing by the previous thing in the set. And if you're going to complain about it, we're just going to walk straight into the same conversation we had a minute ago about the contingency argument. In fact, it just is the thing. So at this point, Craig is defending the Kalam by just appealing to the contingency argument, right? So I'm not saying that that means it's completely decisively dead, but I just mean what's the point of the Kalam at this point? Let's just talk about the contingency argument anyway.
Oh
So
yeah. Yeah, I mean, maybe so. Yeah, by the way, like that argument from J.P. Moreland was like shockingly bad. Wow.
yeah,
But anyway, like, so maybe the more modern way of like defending the second premise is like, well, I mean, what Rob Coons, Alexander Proust do is like they'll take like this premise, the universe began to exist, and they'll say, well, let's make that a bit more precise. Maybe there are like more rigorous principles I can set out that will like basically do the same work as that premise. Maybe something about like temporal finitism, causal history finitism, whatever. And then give an argument from like Benedetti paradoxes to
right.
that conclusion. And so now this argument is, I mean, if you read their work, it gets really technical, but roughly, I think like it requires a few devices. One, it requires the idea of like Benedetti paradoxes or the Grim Reaper paradox, and then, at least that's a specific version of it. Then it requires this idea of a patchwork principle. So maybe you can explain both of those devices and then roughly like fill in the argument.
Sure. Okay. So um, we're gonna. So Benedetti comes up with this idea first, but we don't need to get sidetracked into that. But let's think about it in terms of like there's a thing which we can call a reaper, but really all that means is I mean in the Kuhn's example, it's like this every Grim Reaper's got an allotted time, and they're going to kill Fred if he's still alive at that allotted time. Um, but what it does introduces is the more general notion that we can just think about it as um, there's some proposition or some property that holds at a time if and only if it has never happened prior to that. So we call it like the P or the at if and only if not before principle, right? That's how Shackle puts it. So that's just what when we're talking about Grim Reapers, we just mean something that embodies that principle. Now it could be like a printer that gets a piece of paper, and if there's nothing on the piece of paper, it puts today's date on it, right? And that would do just as well. Like arrange a sequence of them
Yeah.
like that, and then that all of a sudden that's what we mean when we say Grim Reaper. It doesn't have to be as fanciful as like a Reaper killing Fred or whatever. And like this is to forestall the inevitable objection, which is people say things like, "Oh well, what if Fred like doesn't die or he escapes or something?" It's like it doesn't matter. Don't worry about Fred. Like that's not the detail is not about that, right? It's about an abstract logical puzzle. Your thought is that like if you have that property, let's suppose we've got a beginningless sequence, and that property is P is true for each of the elements of that sequence. P is true at that moment, if and only if it's not true at any earlier moment. Right? That's principle one, the at if and only if not before principle. And then the second thing is the sequence has no beginning. It goes in whatever we just meant as the before direction, that's open in that direction. Right? And the combination of those two things is inconsistent. You can derive contradictions from them. Now, the way that like patchwork principle stuff comes in is that people like Coons and Proust want to say things like, look, an individual printer where if you give it a piece of paper, if it's blank, it'll write today's date on it. That's obviously possible. Like you can just gerrymander an actual printer to easily do that. Like a piece of computer code could easily write yourself to do that. So it must be possible. Individual Grim Reaper is possible. Now, if the past was beginningless, then the patchwork principle just says like if there's room, you can cut and paste an individually possible thing to fill the room of right. There's David Lewis calls it to do with the notion of plentitude, and there's no gaps in possible space. Like if a tiger is possible and a lion is possible, then a lion and a tiger is possible together. Something like that. It would be weird if they weren't like combinable like that. So he thinks that if there could be a Grim Reaper over here or today, then it could have been a Grim Reaper yesterday and a Grim Reaper today. That kind of thing. Like they're disjoint entities, so you should be able to cut and paste them next to each other. There's no problem. But then if that principle is true, this sort of cut and paste principle, if you like, and the past is beginningless, then you could have cut and pasted the Grim Reaper into every time in the past. Or you could have had this printer checking every day to see if the piece of paper's got something on it, right? But then you just derive the contradiction again, because like suppose the piece of paper doesn't have anything written on it, Then he puts today's date on it. But hold on, what about yesterday's printer? It would have received a blank piece of paper, and it is supposed to follow this rule. So that would have been a contradiction. Otherwise, it has some date on it when it gets the piece of paper. But what date could it be? Can't be yesterday, because that would mean that the day before we have the same issue where the printer receives a blank piece of paper but doesn't print anything onto it, right? So no way of resolving that. Like, it's just a contradiction either way. So they think you get that contradiction from Benedetti just on the assumption that the past is beginningless, and the seemingly uncontroversial cut and paste principle, disjoint things, you can cut and rearrange them, and that the result is possible. So basically, they're saying from plausible premises, along with the assumption that the past is infinite, you'd get this actual contradictions. And then we've got an improvement, at least on Hilbert's hotel argument, where there's not even a prospect of a contradiction or whatnot.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah. So that sets it up.
Yeah. So then it's like, okay, so we have one, if the reapers are individually possible, and the patchwork principle is true, and also an infinite past is possible.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then these three, we can get a contradiction. So now what they want to do is, like, they want to say, okay, we should accept the individual reapers are possible, and we can't deny the patchwork principle, because they think it's a very plausible principle in terms of the epistemology of modality. And like Kuhns will frequently say, like, we use this every day in some way, shape, or form. We use some kind of patchwork principle to like piece together which situations are possible. So we can't give that up. And so then they say, well, what we should give up is the assumption that an infinite past is possible. That's what we should give up.
Yeah.
And now I think this is not a good approach, but what do you think about it? Like, do you think that's the right solution? I obviously not, but like, what's your preferred?
Right. So, well, one of the things we mentioned very briefly at the beginning was this thought that one of the premises is good for an Aristotelian or a Humean, and the other one's good for an anti-Humean, right? This is me and Dan's paper about the argument for no one. So here the idea is that there is a kind of additional premise that we haven't really mentioned, which is that the powers of the reapers are intrinsic powers, which is just to say that like they would have them in any context that you cut and paste them into. It's not just a power that they only have in virtue of being in a specific context. They would take their powers with them if you were to move them around. Now that, as a principle, is just a straightforward anti-Humean principle. It embodies a notion of like realism about causal powers, and like Hume famously said, causation is like a figment of our imagination. It doesn't really exist in the world. He denies necessary connections between things, right? So his whole theory of causation is based on like habituation and expectation of like outcomes following from like inputs or whatever. But it's a kind of subjective account. He's denying that that's true in the world itself or whatever. So the Humean just doesn't think anything has those types of powers. So he's not going to buy that premise. But then the cut and paste principle, if you're someone who thinks there are genuine causal powers in the world, then you have to restrict the applicability of the patchwork principle. And one way to think about that is like, suppose one kind of let's call it like a thick modal property, like a causal power thought of in this anti-Humean way. One of those would be like fragility, right? So this wine glass is fragile, and what that means is if I knock it off its tabletop at a dinner party or something, as it's tumbling towards the floor with nothing about to swoop in and catch it or whatever, no bubble wrap on the floor, nothing like that, from the relevant height, like it's going to smash. Right? It's just inevitable. It's just a consequence of it being like that. But like for the Humean, he's going to say, well, there's no real, yeah, sure, you habituated to expect that. That's fine. But strictly speaking, there are no necessary connections in nature. And that means that, like, taken to its extreme, at least in this case, we could cut and paste that like time slice of the wine glass tumbling, inevitably towards the ground, but just paste in some next step where it's just resting quite comfortably on the ground. Right? That's the patchwork principle. Just says, sure, I can just cut and paste these things together because there are no necessary connections in nature. So anything can coexist with anything else. Right? So if you are not a Humean, you have to say That type of cut and pasting is not going to fly here, right? Sometimes you can't just cut and paste stuff. The wine glass is definitely going to hit the floor, and any cutting and pasting doesn't represent a genuine metaphysical possibility. It's kind of spurious possibility that doesn't really exist. So they're going to reject that patchwork principle. So the intrinsic causal powers stuff, if you're a Humean, you're not going to buy that. This like unrestricted cut and pasting, you're not going to buy that if you're an anti-Humean. So, but plausibly, everyone's either a Humean or an anti-Humean. You either think there are necessary connections in the world or you don't. So, you can't, game over for the argument, right? It's a nice, I think it's a cute objection. It's quite easy to understand, at least once you get once you internalize the premises and you understand the difference between the Humean and anti-Humean view. It just seems very like cartoonishly simple how you couldn't hold all of the premises at the same time.
Yeah, and then have they, by the way, have either Alexander Proust or Kuhns or maybe even Rasmussen, have they responded to your objection yet? Or?
Well, I wrote a blog post about it ages ago, and
Okay.
when I talked to Kuhns, I brought it up. I can't really remember what he said off the top of my head, but our paper came out in Synthase, which is a philosophy journal, not very long ago, like a month ago or something. So I sent it over to Rob saying, you would probably be interested in this kind of thing. And he said, thanks very much. So I imagine he's mulling it over. I can't imagine him going, oh, you're right. I've been defeated. I admit that's not going to happen. So he'll probably say something and, kind of look forward to seeing what the reply is. It's probably going to be, he's a very thoughtful and high quality philosopher. Again, crazy political views, obviously, but like as a philosopher, as an analytic philosopher, he's a top quality guy. So it would be it's incredibly like I don't expect someone like him to even pay attention to anything I say. So it's nice that he is.
Yeah. Okay, so it's probably a good question to end on. So here is kind of my natural reaction towards this. I doubt this is a very popular view, but I kind of think about it this way. Okay, so the Reapers are obviously individually possible. And okay, it's also like, so I also think though that it is obviously the case that an infinite past is possible. Okay, so then now what? But so then that means that what I should do is I should just think like I should just reject the patchwork principle. It seems like either that or so like it seems like I guess it's kind of like a Moorean approach. It strikes me that it is so obvious that an infinite past is possible, and it is so obvious that the individual reapers are possible that just like reject whatever else is like in between, something like that. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, yeah. So like there are ways that you can just sort of you don't have to go like full anti-Humean to think that there might be some restriction to the Patchwork principle anyway. I mean, what is the Patchwork principle? You might say that it's an infallible guide to metaphysical possibility, but I mean, another way to think about it is it's a kind of like it's a tool that's about the epistemology of modality. Like, how do I know what's possible? And it thought about like that, you'd kind of expect it to not necessarily always be completely correct. It's like a kind of generalization that we've acquired through exposure to examples, and like it's really good at predicting what's possible when it comes to like medium-sized dry goods. Like if I have a box and a filing cabinet or whatever, then I can have both of them together. Some kind of like mundane recombination thing. We don't like typically find counterexamples to it in that sense. So like it's good as far as it goes. It's like a guide that you hire to show you around the town that you're not familiar with. That doesn't mean that the guide's going to be able to show you around every single place that you might think of going. He's good at one thing. That's all that we really know about the Patchwork principle. So like, is it an infallible guide when it comes to exotic metaphysical speculations like this? You might just say, well, I don't know. I'm just less confident about it in that case. So like if it starts to rub up against things that I find intuitively plausible, like if you're saying I find the idea of a beginningless past just like deeply intuitively plausible, it might just be that like the guide who's showing you around the town he's not familiar with and says you should go down this dark alleyway over here, he might just be wrong. He might just like not know what he's talking about when you come to this kind of exotic scenario that he's not familiar with. You just think like the principle of thought of as epistemological guide to how we can come to know not things about modality is just fallible. It's like not a perfectly good guide. I think that's perfectly reasonable. So there's a view about this, which Felipe Leon and Peter van Inwagen, I think, have developed this a bit, like a modal skepticism, I think, where it's like you'd say to yourself something like, I know stuff like basic modal truths, like if P is actual, then P is possible, things like that. But by direct experience of those types of things, right? Like I know that it's possible that I can cut this lime in half because I just did, and now it's actual. So that's enough to show that it's possible or something, right? But when it's like, but could there be an infinitely big hotel? And what about transfinite arithmetic? Blah blah blah. Now you're so far away from your wheelhouse that you're familiar with that your level of confidence just has to go down. Correspondingly, we should be like humble in those sorts of scenarios, and that's just like another way of saying, I like this patchwork principle, but I'm not going to buy any principle like that as a completely infallible tool, because I'm kind of skeptical of my own abilities to reason completely effectively when I'm way outside my my direct experience, the world of things that I'm acquainted with more directly. So I think there's very principled. There's tons of ways you can object to this type of thing.
Yeah, cool. Okay, cool. So everyone should watch Alex's podcast, read his paper. I'll link it in the description whenever I upload this video. Cool. Yeah, but thanks for coming on.
No problem. It's been really fun. Thanks for having me.